Hello, and welcome to Day 5 of Academy Health's 2020 Annual Research Meeting. I hope you have been enjoying the new sessions this week, as well as catching up on all the great content from last week, and also discussing with the presenters the content and joining the conversation on social media using hashtag ARM20. Now, this plenary today is one of 3 specifically addressing issues of racism and the way it affects our colleagues, our work, and our mission to improve health and healthcare for all. Last week, we started with Dr. Ruha Benjamin's tremendous keynote on race and data. And if you haven't seen it, the recording is available, and I strongly recommend it. Today, Dr. Taylor is going to be leading his colleagues in a conversation about systemic racism more broadly, including how it manifests in our institutions and our workforce. And tomorrow, we will turn the lens inward for a frank discussion of how systemic racism and power affect and are affected by our associations, the publishers in our field, our funders, and academic institutions. It is my intent and hope that this arc of discussion, including the increased awareness and discussion of racism woven throughout many of our breakout sessions, will help you consider your own institutions and your individual roles, and will model for you the important work of being honest, transparent, and yes, a little uncomfortable in order to become better allies, better researchers, and more effective translators of our work so that we can truly improve health and healthcare for all. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, Dr. Donald Taylor, who is a professor of public policy at Duke University and director of the Duke Social Science Research Institute. Over to you, Don.
Thank you so much. So I've attended 23 of the last 25 ARMs in person, and now I'm 1-for-1 virtual. So sorry not to be with everybody in person, but really excited and glad that we're talking about confronting structural racism in health services research. Even 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been unimaginable for me to imagine being a moderator for a session like this. One of the things I have come to understand as I have had increasing leadership roles at Duke University, first as the chair of the faculty and now as the director of a research institute, is really that white people, we have a part to play in both the creation of the problem, but also in owning the responsibility for the solution. And as Lisa said, I actually feel super uncomfortable right now. And if we are going as a field to truly direct or truly confront structural racism in health services research, we're going to have to commit to going to places that seem a bit uncomfortable. We are all, by inclination, analysts, and we're going to have to learn how to analyze ourselves, come up with practical strategies to change how we do things. So I'm super excited today to be able to moderate a panel. We have 4 great speakers. I'm going to give a light introduction to each of them, and then I've asked each of them to give about a 90-second intro into what they're thinking, what their main sort of initial point would be around our topic on confronting structural racism in HSR. After the 4th panelist, who's Austin Frakt, gives his initial statement, we're going to have a poll that's going to be launched, and you're invited to participate there. And then after that, I'm going to help moderate what I hope will be a vibrant discussion, including the chance to take questions from the audience. So the first colleague is Dr. Cherylin Black. She is a NIH-funded neuroscientist who's a professor in the Duke University School of Medicine. She has, in the last few years, become Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement at Duke. So she's both a scholar, a researcher, a faculty member, and now someone with the institutional responsibility to help see to addressing structural racism at Duke. So Sherilynn, could you just give us your initial thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. And I think this is going to be a really rich discussion. I think, when you sent us the questions, you asked us to think about what's on our hearts and minds right now. And I would say the overwhelming sentiment that I feel is that there is a level of exhaustion and fatigue and frustration around this topic that I've never seen before. I have seen conditions where we as an academic community are motivated by policy changes, by things that are required and mandated for us to be able to do our research successfully. But now I see a space where it seems as though there's a line, there's a clear delineation, and people are on one side or the other. And I think that, there's been a real push to acknowledge that our academic institutions were not designed for individuals in an equitable manner. They were not designed to combat structural racism, and they were not designed to ensure the success of all of the scholars that are present. So now I think we're at a true inflection point historically where we can actually start looking systemically at what are the parameters that are leading to this inequity and how do we fix it, and move away from this antiquated model that we need to intervene on individuals from diverse backgrounds instead of on the system, which is actually racist itself. We shouldn't fix people to fit a racist structure. We should fix the racist structure. So I think right now there's a lot of momentum and inertia. The question is, what are we going to do about it?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Linda Goler Blount. She is a master's in public health. She is the president and CEO of Black Women's Health Imperative. And before that, she was the first person who vice president of inequality at the American Cancer Society. So, Linda, thank you for being with us. What's on your heart and your mind as we're taking this topic on?
Yeah, thank you, Don, so much, and I'm happy to be here. And I think similar to Dr. Black, I'm looking at this from the perspective of what we do in my organization for women and the toll of COVID-19 and our country's absolutely abysmal public health response, then coupled with the racial tension brought on by yet another video of seeing a Black person murdered by law enforcement. I'm thinking about the effect it's having on Black women's emotional and physical health. Black women are having to assume greater responsibilities in the workplace as white co-workers at all levels who seek to be assured want them to explain what's happening. They're having to figure out how to educate their children who are not in school, how to care for family members. They're neglecting their own health, or they no longer have access to healthcare because they've lost jobs. And frankly, if we look at the current projections for infections and mortality from COVID-19, and assuming there's no vaccine, by sometime in 2022, every Black person in the US will have lost a first-degree relative to COVID-19. So I'm afraid Black women's health will suffer at the intersection of COVID-19, racism, and poverty. And I'm worried that too many Black women and their families simply won't recover. And this will add to the COVID-19 death toll. And around health services research, I'm worried that we won't actually put into practice what we know. Our approach at this moment is trying to help people understand how they need to address the issues of other people instead of looking at themselves and their institutions. And so this is not what this is about. This is not for companies and organizations and academic institutions and hospitals to figure out what they're going to do with these other folks. They need to figure out what they're going to do. And on top of it all, I haven't seen my 13-month-old grandson in 6 months.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Thank you for being with us. Our next panelist is Stephen Brown. He's a research associate at Urban Institute in the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population. He does research and policy analysis focused on upward mobility, and he also does consulting trying to help organizations develop solutions to address racial inequality. And since he's not already busy enough, he's a PhD candidate in sociology at Harvard. So Stephen Brown, thank you for being with us. What's on your heart and your mind this morning, or this afternoon, I guess it just became?
Thank you, Don, for that introduction. And I will say that it is a real privilege to be on this panel speaking to all of you today. I think for folks who have been thinking about and doing research around structural racism, racial equity, this is a really eye-opening moment where I think for folks who've been doing this work, like, and trying to articulate how important it is, there's been this groundswell of all these organizations, all these people trying to really come to terms with, like, oh, wow, this is kind of a really fundamental piece of how we do research. It's not something we do on the side. It's not something that fits into a little box. This is what core of how we think about and how we engage our fellow citizens, our fellow brothers and sisters. And I think that has been in some ways, very heartwarming, encouraging, because I think it is a real opportunity for folks to really understand how our work, how our research, how we engage these topics really does have impacts on people of color and how we engage one another in our daily lives. And on people's social and health outcomes. So that's encouraging. But at the same time, I think, it's really important that folks understand that this is not, an opportunity where we are going to have a big shift, ideally, but that big shift is not, getting over a hump and getting past something. I think this is really about re-understanding how we engage, how we incorporate, how we talk about, how we think about, discuss these social problems, these social issues that we all have to share, that we all deal with. And so I think I am, again, encouraged, but at the same time, cautiously optimistic that we're going to see improvements. But I do think it is really important for us to be able to really see the people who are being touched, see the people who are being affected, to really empathize and see them as ourselves, right? Because we are the people who are being hurt. Our communities are being affected. And I think it's really important that people recognize that we are all in this together, and that requires listening to the voices, listening to perspectives, and taking that seriously in how we engage our analytic work.
Thank you, Stephen. Our fourth finalist is Frakt. He's a health economist at Boston University, and he's the director of the Partnered Evidence-Based Policy Center. He's the editor-in-chief of the Incidental Economist, and he writes at the New York Times Upshot and JAMA Health Policy Forum. Austin, I think first and foremost, is a great communicator of complicated subjects. So, Austin, what are you thinking and feeling today about this topic?
Thanks, Don. Yeah, my feelings start with the fundamental truth that there's structural racism in HSR. It's a discipline that grew up 6 decades ago with racist laws, practices, and policies all around it. So it's unavoidable that it affected HSR as well. For myself and many others, I think there used to be it was popular to say we were colorblind, and I think for me that equated to a lack of attention to racism, and that doesn't mean it wasn't there. It means I didn't look for it, and that wasn't satisfactory then, and it's not satisfactory now. What it leads to is kind of passivity that tacitly supports the structural racism that we know is there, even if we don't see it yet. So, this idea that I told myself that I wasn't racist was just that. It was just a story I told myself. It didn't have any impact on my community or the institutions where I work. And this is really an unjustified and unjustifiable privilege of whiteness. I had the privilege to be able to just step away from racism because it didn't affect me directly, not in such a way that I noticed. And that's not a privilege everybody has. My Black colleagues do not. So change for myself and HSR and other areas is going to require, for white people, rejecting this privilege. We and I need to challenge, this is what I really think about. I have to challenge myself every day to reject that. And many of us are doing this now because we're shocked by the videos of Black people being murdered by police, but we have to maintain that focus we feel now without requiring that kind of horror. It shouldn't take that. So we really have to find a way to make anti-racism critical to our own humanity, even and especially for we white people. So one way I'm approaching this is through my public writing in the New York Times and elsewhere. And writing about racism for me is a big effort. It's big, and I am frightened every time I do it. I'm frightened of being miscommunicating and being misunderstood. But I think it's super important to push through those fears. To not do that would be to go back to what I was doing before, which is just tacitly accepting the way things have been. And so I try to push through them. I get feedback on my writing, solicited and not. It's hard to hear when you've worked so hard. It's hard to hear, hey, maybe you didn't get something right. But this is the key message. It's important to hear that. It's important to listen to it and to hear it and to accept the challenges and to not walk away, to keep going in that direction.
So, Austin, in my rural Southern Baptist upbringing self, I'm going to give you an amen on that. Well said. And that's very high praise where I come from, indeed. Thanks. Let's go to Dr. Cherylin Black. Sherilynn, if you could, you've been a scholar, you are a scholar, a faculty member, now you're working in the Vice Provost Office for Faculty Advancement at Duke. Just to try to help us get as concrete as possible in a university, if you could change one thing about the culture or one policy at Duke to try to upend structural racism at Duke, what would it be?
So I think for me, the answer to that question would be the way that topics of racism are handled across the board. And that is to say, race is a part of academic discourse. It is a part of being a professional colleague at an institution. It is a part of the core and fabric of who we are as a society. But for some reason, people cannot seem to get to a point where they do not rate the evidence-driven data around racism and what's happening systemically in organizations above their personal and lived experience, especially people in majority groups. So what happens is we see people who are in positions of power making decisions that are not evidence-based, that are not in consultation with experts on race or diversity and inclusion, are solely off of what feels good or feels right. And my response to that is always, if people knew what to do in spaces like that, academia would not be a systemically racist institute on the whole. What we really need to see is more collaboration with experts in this space. We need to see more individuals treating race with the rigor that it deserves. One example I always give is, I'm a neuroscientist. If I was doing an experiment on T cell proliferation, I would not read one book about T cells or read one journal article about T cells and think that I was expert enough to know how to systemically change everything there is about T cells. I would go to an immunologist and talk through what made sense. We've got to start thinking that way when we're addressing race and high systemic levels at institutions and organizations. Otherwise, it will continue to be a practice of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks and never actually changing anything in a longitudinal or systemic way.
Thank you. Linda Blount, I'm acutely aware I started by saying even 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined myself moderating this session, but you've been giving your life to this work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and ask you if my experience resonates with your long understanding of these topics. I found in a couple of faculty-only groups at Duke where we start to try to talk about racism or structural racism that folks immediately want to expand it. So what about LGBTQ rights? What about people who are differentially abled? I'm wondering what you think about that. Do we need to focus on race alone, or is it better looked at in more of an intersectional kind of approach?
Yeah, that becomes the issue with this conversation, because it makes people fundamentally uncomfortable. So when you're uncomfortable, then let's expand the tent so we can find an area where we can be comfortable, yes. Talking about ableism, talking about other kinds of discrimination and isms. But the fact is that where we are right now has grown out of the anti-slavery movement. And we've seen it in multiple places throughout history: the civil rights movement, the Black feminist movement, the Me Too movement. These things were started, and yes, we had allies, but by Black people, but then appropriated by other movements, the white feminist movement, gay rights, other movements came out of that, which is fine. But what happens as people think about this, it actually dilutes the original intent of the movement. And so our attention gets distracted. We're no longer talking about sort of the Black rights or civil rights movement, but let's talk about all rights. And that way everybody can find their place. And we see it now in the all lives matter kind of tropes that are going around, but it has the effect of minimizing the people and their issues, and at worst denying that they're even valid in the first place. And when we think about health services research, we want to say a rising tide lifts all ships, but that doesn't. Improving access in general does not improve access for everyone. As we look at health outcomes and we talk about access to insurance, they're dependent on access to insurance, the type of insurance. That's dependent on the type of job you have. That's dependent on your education and your preparation. That's dependent upon where you live and how much money you have. And all of that is impacted by policies that are, frankly, specifically designed to promote racism by preventing access to Black people. So now we need policies that are actually designed to combat racism in institutions and personally. And when we think about social determinants of health, it has become this sort of general bucket that allows people to separate themselves from the institutions. So to be sure, sexual harassment, sexism, these are all important to health outcomes, but when that patient is Black, there's no way to separate their experience from racism.
So we've got to maintain some focus here to do a good job, to have it even a chance to do a good job. Stephen Brown, I know that a lot of your research has been focused on upward mobility and how to enable people to be judged fairly. Is there something from your research findings and your research career that you would bring to us as we try to make our institutions and organizations more just and fair with respect to race?
Great question. But before I get to that, I think there may have been a poll that was supposed to go out for all of our viewers.
Yes, gosh, Stephen should have been the moderator of the session. I totally messed up. My apologies.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that
I think that there is a poll that was going to be put out that asks a couple of questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if that poll could go out now, we will keep talking and folks will be able to hear us, and then we can get back to that. Thank you so much, Stephen.
No, happy to help. So what can, so as I understand the question, what is it that organizations can do in order to take this seriously and to make improvements? And so I think the first thing that's fundamental is awareness. At an organizational level, I think there needs to be some awareness and recognition that there is a problem, that the organization has very likely engaged in some practices that have disparaged and discouraged Black people and other people of color, and that they need to essentially recognize that is happening. And of course, there are many different ways that we do that, but primarily talk to the folks who work there, listen to their stories, hear their experiences. But first is awareness. That is fundamental. Like, you can't solve a problem you don't know. And then I think something that we've learned, and I think has also come out a lot in the research, is you have to examine whatever the, for lack of a better word, business practices for your particular organization, whether that is producing research or producing some product. Like, how do you engage with external audiences? What do you put out in the world? And I think how you engage with that depends on whatever it is that product you're putting out in the world. But I do think part of that is recognizing who gets access to creating those products, who gets access to deciding what those products look like, who gets access to engaging with external actors. And so I think evaluating systems and opportunity structures for people to kind of to perform at a high level, to be a part of the decision making of like, how do we as an organization present ourselves to the world, and how do we influence the kind of products that go out? And so, if that's researchers, what does your tenure process look like? How does the service that junior faculty get to do that have to do often on the side, like incorporate to what that means for the tenure process? I work at a research organization. We put out multiple new policy reports daily. And so what does that mean for how we engage with funders? What does it mean for who gets to write those products, who gets to write those proposals, who gets to sit on those who gets to be the PI for those projects, right? And so I think, how do you engage people in whatever it is your product development looks like? But then there's also an internal piece, right? It's not just like how do you engage with external, but internal, right? Is it an environment that's welcoming, that's accepting, that's inclusive? Are there opportunities for people to, bring their lived experience into their work, into how they engage with their colleagues? And so if it's an environment where it's like there's one size fits all and you have to kind of follow the system, I think that's an environment where it's really hard to let people come in and bring their own flavor, their own viewpoint into that perspective. So that's really important to think about, look at internal processes. And I think, and then the final big thing is accountability. This is the big one. So whatever your goal is, right, you set targets, and it has to come from the top. The presidents, the people in the executive offices, have to essentially say, this is something that's really important to us, and these are our benchmarks. This is when we're going to meet XYZ target. Maybe we don't meet it, that's fine, but how you're making progress. Like, we do this with anyone who's ever had any leadership responsibility has been in a situation where they've had to set targets and they've had to have benchmarks. And so just like anything else, creating accountability structures is fundamental to getting people promoted, getting them tenure, getting them, helping them facilitate the process of, moving forward in their career. And I think it also helps identify sticking points and problems where people are like, okay, this is not working. This is not working for this department. This is not working for this group of people. How do we then figure out, talk to those folks to figure out a structure that does promote them, that does get them an opportunity where they can be themselves, bring themselves to the work, do the work that they find valuable, and contribute to the broader intellectual community.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the strengths of Academy Health is we have all types of organizations. We have, research organizations that are standalones. We have universities. We have corporations. And I just want to go out of turn very quickly, since you mentioned tenure, which is irrelevant for many people, but for folks in universities, it's often something we think a lot about. Sherilynn, could you tell us just a little bit about what Duke has been doing in terms of altering its tenure process and approach to try to be more equitable?
Yeah, there's been a number of things that we've been working on that's been led by the vice provost that I work with, Abbas Ben Mamoun. And one of them is that there's been an overhaul of all of the tenure standards at Duke. Every school, every department has had to revamp the way that their tenure standards are written, to think about equity, to think about the way that individuals are being promoted. We've also looked very closely at the nature of the research, what's considered fundamental to the field and what's considered niche, what's considered off to the side, and thinking about where do those assumptions come from and how does that influence people thinking about the sort of rigor and the prominence of your work. There's also been a lot thinking about the ways that different forms of prominence can be involved in thinking about the way that you advance through tenure. There's a lot that happens that might not be in the traditional guise of the way academics typically think about promotion. Again, I think Linda mentioned this earlier. A lot of those methods actually have been shown through documented evidence to be linked to racism, but there hasn't been any change with those structures at all. And so I think we've really done a deep dive into thinking about how to make the entire tenure process more inclusive across the board. One thing that Stephen said that I think is really important is that while we make these changes, it's incredibly important to link them to accountability metrics to see if they actually work. Because there are a lot of schools, hospitals, agencies right now that are really, really enthusiastic and are saying, yes, I want to make changes. But if you don't have effectiveness measures that you can actually look at outcomes and see that change, the intervention may have not been successful. And I think we can't be lazy when we're trying to think about how to change systems. We actually have to create structures that can be assessed on the back end. And I think that's a really important part. So as we're going through the way we've changed this tenure process, we'll see how things unfold.
Right. So we can't just say it's broken. We've got to say, and here's how we're going to fix it. And then to Stephen's point, we've got to have lines of accountability, and it's got to be the folks at the top of the organization have got to be responsible.
Yes.
So Austin, and thinking of this issue of communication and impact, I mean, blogging is so important, and Austin is just an acute communicator of things. Austin, I was wondering what you think about I think the rise of social determinants of health as something that everyone seems to now say, yes, that's important, and how you think about writing about social determinants of health through this lens of racism or white privilege.
Yeah, well, it's a tough question in a way, because my thinking about this is evolving so rapidly with each time I write about social terms of health or racism. I as I said, I received some feedback, and I want to actually come back to something Linda said, and others have said it too, that there's a degree, and I said it earlier, degree of discomfort in engaging with that feedback. And the way I view discomfort is that it's a signal of a problem. And you can, of course, you can run away from it. If we call it discomfort because it's uncomfortable. But if you want to actually do something, you have to go toward discomfort. You don't do anything worthwhile by running away from difficult things. You just don't. That's not how the world works. You can look at anything anybody's ever done. They've done it because they've done something hard. So just to get back to your question, when I started engaging on social terms of health in my work and writing, I didn't see or fully absorb the connection with racism. Now, and actually this is something, Linda played a role in a project that I'm on, and she and others communicated this, that a lot of what we call social terms of health, you just peel that onion not very far, and racism is right there. That's something I've learned. So now, when I come to write about it again, that's going to be, front and center. Whereas, a few months ago, 6 months ago, it wouldn't have. That's my own education happening.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I resonate with that as well, that social determinants of health, in one sense, language-wise, has been co-opted to when sometimes we need to talk about racism, to talk about something else that's sort of a downstream derivative of that. I want to ask a question just to the panel and see who's interested in it. In the last 10 weeks or so, there have been weeks when like 9 of the top 10 New York Times bestsellers have been about race or racism in some way, whether they're memoirs or other types of books. And recently there's been pushback against the book White Fragility in particular. And I was just curious of what all of you are thinking about that, if you're thinking about the pushback against that book. Linda's smiling.
Okay, I'll just jump in. So I wasn't a fan. I read the book, but I wasn't a fan. And I have to admit, I agree a bit with what John McWhorter said. Is it well intended, of course, but it paints this picture of what we see in diversity and inclusion. And I'll just go on record as having trouble with the whole diversity and inclusion kind of practice, as we people in power need to help these people who can't, don't, won't, whatever. And I see it in the language all the time. I was just reading a diversity document that was put together, and it literally was saying, avoid doing this, avoid doing this, avoid doing this, avoid doing this. And it gives the people who are in power this perception that they've got to somehow care for these folks who don't know what to do or couldn't exist or thrive without their assistance. And so I appreciate that there's attention paid to this. It makes sense because of what's going on. But it's the way we use language, and the way we're using language is not helping at this moment. It's not really clarifying that the reason we are in this state is not because these folks were helpless. We're in this state because people were brought against their will to this country and enslaved and dehumanized for hundreds of years.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that book, or does anybody have a book? If somebody said, I want to read a book to start myself thinking about it, would you, anybody want to suggest a different book? I didn't ask people this. I should have asked them that question.
I mean, I can tell you a few things that I've found helpful. How to be, I'm sorry. So you want to talk about race is one of them. The movie 13th I found very powerful. The great podcast called Seeing White, which views racism through a white lens in a way. I don't want to try to characterize it. It's very good. Eloquent Rage, Brittany Cooper's book, also very powerful. And then I've read a whole bunch of history. Actually, A Warmth of Other Suns, about the migration from the South to the North and West. I could go on, but those are the top several in recent months that I've been very impactful on me.
Yeah.
I can, Don, I'll also just toss in our colleague Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Racists. I think that is one that will challenge a lot of people and broaden perspectives significantly.
Yeah, and I actually think in two separate groups of faculty at Duke, we have read Racism Without Racists and White Fragility and read them together. And it's the one thing I will say about White Fragility, for at least a few folks that I know, white folks that I know, there was something about the language in the book that was a pop in the mouth that got their attention in a way that nothing else had to that point. So, but of course, this is part of the never-ending discussion and dialogue and trying to figure out, how we do this in a better way. Stephen, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, I think it's always. I mean, I'll say always preferable to the extent you can if you want to understand a particular problem, whether it's in the criminal justice system or education or not problem. But if you want to understand a particular area, right? It's as a group of folks who are analysts, as you pointed out, is good to kind of dig in those particular areas and read those folks. But I will say broadly, the ones that have been most influential in my thinking are actually quite old, though I would include The Warmth of Other Sun as a really great book. It's very long, but it's a great book. And it's a roll of to have a new book that's coming out, I think, literally today called Cast. That's also, I'm really looking forward to reading. But in terms of older books, honestly, Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk is a fundamental foundational text that I don't think some of the important and critical lessons from that have changed all that much in the past centuries that we've read in it. And so it's a short one, so I'd highly recommend that. And then honestly, anything from King's collected writings, so not just, the I Have a Dream speech, but, to really kind of go through his biography and his writings. Because again, I don't think the lessons from that have changed very much. And so I think those are some additional sources I would recommend that folks kind of dig into.
And Steve, just to balance off of that, one thing I would like to say as well is, you just mentioned the culmination of King's works. It's important to remember that with all these books that we mentioned, they should not be without action after reading them. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that is extremely challenging, is that there are a lot of very well-intended people who are very linked and tied to reading these texts and proudly saying they read them, but then what are you doing? And so I think that, that's one thing really, for us to change anything in HSR research, there's got to be some sort of link to action when you're raising awareness as well, and not just staying in that comfortable space of reading and internalizing and then not actually having it change outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Tom, can I jump in on the action point that Sherilynn made?
Yeah, please. Go ahead, sure.
Yeah, I've been thinking about action a lot, and I wonder. It's so interesting. A couple months ago, when I was just reading, I was wondering where's the action going to come from for me? And I realized that by doing this thing I talked about, by trying to, I can't say that I succeed every day, but I try to keep in my mind every day, not forgetting, keep reminding myself about, that structural racism exists, and just, and the reading helps me, reading something every day helps me. I start to tune in to where opportunities are for change in my institutions, in the center that I lead, or in the department that I'm a part of, or in a community group, church, in a family, my family conversations. So my point is, sometimes it's hard to think in advance what the change will be at an individual level or a local level. And a lot of the advice I see out there is by necessity, if it's going to reach a mass audience, it's very generic. But if you want to know specifically what is it for you to change, I think the only way to do that is to have this in your mind so constantly that when you see that opportunity, you're ready for it. You know what I mean? And I think change won't come for individuals, or they won't act to make change if they do the thing that I and many have done for a long time, which is just say, well, I'm not racist, therefore it's not my problem, and forget about it. Then you don't do anything.
Hey, Sherilyn, I'm wondering, as a neuroscientist, are there ways we can try to train our minds to be more present and more aware and look at what's around us in this area?
Yeah, there are definitely things that you can do. And I want to start by saying, Linda mentioned this earlier, but the convergence of the pandemic with COVID-19 on top of all of the sort of explosion around race that's happened has been very interesting, because there's a lot of research that shows that when any of us are in situations where we feel that we are perceived to be in the midst of trauma, it makes us more egocentric. That will not be surprising. But in addition to that, when we are in high states of stress, we also have a very hard time facilitating empathy, and we link very closely to our innate tendencies. And our innate tendencies for all of us is bias. We all have bias. It's a biological phenomenon. I always tell people, the first thing you can do is examine your role in contributing to structural racism. And to go off of what Austin just said, a lot of people immediately are like, well, I'm not a racist, I'm an ally, I do these other things. We all have biases. So doing things like taking the implicit indicator test that Harvard has online, this is something that's been around for many, many years. Start to examine what are the biases that you have and confront them and own them. Don't hyper-rationalize them away to the point that you think that it's not your problem. If you are in a space where you are working in a way that is impacting the success of others, that is influencing the ability of others to be promoted, you're reviewing journal articles, you're developing drugs and medications, those all are going to be linked to racist structures if we don't all start first internalizing what we can do with our own bias. The other thing that I would say is that there needs to be a thought, especially amongst people in majority groups, to think about what their own personal culture is. I'm currently involved in a program, a research program for the Gilliam Fellows at Howard Hughes Medical Institute with several colleagues. And one of the things that we found is that the faculty who have taken this course that we've developed have noted that the time when they felt most motivated to actually make the changes is when they could begin to perceive themselves as having a culture and having a space in the conversation. And it's not a them thing, it's an us thing. And this is really interesting because it goes back to the egocentric space that I just mentioned. The reality is, I would love it if humanity were enough, but it's not. It's not enough to say, well, this influences this person, so I should care. That's why I really believe you have to take this out of a morality space and into an evidence-driven space about who am I, how am I contributing to this system, and what are the ways that I can actually begin to improve it. So really working on identifying your personal biases, understanding the space that you occupy in the space with your power and privilege, and then thinking very critically about working every single day, going off of what Austin said, to lead to those behavioral outcomes by making sure that you are viewing yourself as part of the system. But it is challenging, and repetition is key. Having stuff that's, repeated measures is key. Having systems that are longitudinally getting this in front of you are key. Having accountability metrics that put that cognitive pressure on you to change your behavior are key. All of these things are required to actually lead to behavioral outcomes. And the good news is that research shows you can do it if you're properly motivated. So then the question comes down to what we discussed earlier about what are the proper motivators for each person in this ecosystem we're trying to change? Because again, humanity is not enough. If it were, we would not be fighting about people wearing masks or not wearing masks with COVID. We would not be fighting about if we should care about, did George Floyd deserve to get murdered the way that he did? if humanity were enough, we wouldn't be in this space. But understanding what people's carrots are, whether it's their own compensation, whether it's their ability to do the research or the work that they cause that is important to them, whether it's some sort of personal carrot, whatever it is, you have to understand the currency of the ecosystem that you're trying to move to be able to properly motivate individuals. So perception is also key there as well. So there are a lot of parts in this cognitive discussion. But I think really having that awareness that we are all in hyper ego-driven spaces right now because of COVID, and we are not working to facilitate empathy in the way that we should. Those are places to already start as we start to examine our biases.
And Don, I just want to jump in just to amplify something that Sherilynn said, which is just brilliant. Is there's an exercise that gets done a lot of times in diversity kinds of courses where white people are asked to envision a society without racism, whatever that means. And the question is the first thought that you have what you have to give up? And if that's your first thought, if we have no racism, I have to give up whatever it is, that is really instructive for what the kind of work you need to do and what your view of the world is, because that's how it becomes. It becomes a zero-sum game. If they're going to have something, then I'm going to have less. And that's exactly what Sherilynn is saying is not the case, but that's how people view the world. And that's where you have to start, because we all say we're not racist. But then when you think, well, if we don't have racism, what do I have to give up? That's very instructive. We do what we value. And so this is a place to begin.
Thank you for that. I wanted to read out the results of our poll. It was just a one-question poll. It said, how would you describe yourself when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Select the one that most closely matches your current thinking. And the options were A, I tend not to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nobody said that. B, I think diversity, equity, inclusion is important, but not sure where to begin, 16%. C, I've been thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how it affects my work. Half the folks said that. And I actively consider diversity, equity, inclusion when designing my studies and or choosing my research team. A third of the folks said that. Linda, putting you back on the spot, I think when you mentioned, I think you said something to the effect of that is common language, diversity, equity, inclusion, but you think it's not the best route to where we need to try to get to. Can you help paint us that destination?
Yeah, the field has been, sort of evolved kind of from, food, folks, and fun, and let's all celebrate each other's cultural heritages, to let's try to understand the role of racism in the workplace, in society, and what can be done about it. Now that's at the tail end. Not a whole lot of folks are doing this, but the opportunity is how we look at language, how we use language in this field. When we're talking about data, and I talk to my, colleagues in epidemiology, when we talk about data, look at COVID-19, we lead the listener to believe it's because they're Black. We talk about underlying conditions and obesity-related conditions and that sort of thing. Oh, it's because they're Black. That is not the case. And the value of what we could learn from diversity and inclusion is how to talk about everyone and how to talk about our lived experiences and how to value the lived experiences in whatever setting we're in. And we're talking about research, and Sherilynn said it, we've got to bring the lived experiences of people into the work and not treat diversity, equity, and inclusion as this thing over there that we do while we go back to our happy lives over here being in power. But that takes real work, and that takes self-reflection, self-interrogation. And while we're talking about systems, people make up the systems. People determine the policies that create the system. So it has to begin with the individual.
Yes. I am trying to get into the questions that have been asked to me, and I'm struggling a little bit to see them. Let me see here.
Don, I see him in the presenter chat. There's a couple. Yeah.
Yep. I've got them now. Sorry. Let's see. This is a question of a practical question about research analyses. How should we address structural racism in data analysis? Should we still adjust for race? And I wonder what your reaction to that, the panelists will be to that. How do we measure race, and what are we trying to measure?
So I'll just briefly say we have to obviously consider race.
Yes.
But when we talk about, back to your point about social determinants of health, all researchers should start with, why do we have social determinants of health in the first place? And so describing data by race is fine, so long as we're not leading the reader to believe it's because they're Black. So race is not a risk factor, racism is a risk factor.
So when we put race in, maybe what we need to be is clear about what it is that we're trying to measure and state that plainly. Right. Yep.
And I know on that point, I was going to say, to add to that, I think, this is a complicated question, and, we're probably going to get into methodological and modeling details right here on this call, but I do think one of the things that I have found most helpful, and just in terms of a conceptual way of thinking about this, is one, to do two things. One, to do as best as we can to understand proximate causes. So if you're doing research on a particular outcome and you suspect or hypothesize that there are racial disparities that you're going to find, like, do some interrogating to understand what you think might be the main determining factor, what causal factors may be driving that, and try to measure and model that and include that as part of your research, right? And so instead of just including a race study, like, how do you actually measure the proximate causes and the impact that it has on people in terms of the strategy? And that's one. I think the other one is to think about, just assume that things don't, that these variables that we may be interested in don't necessarily have the same kind of impact or effect across racial lines, right? Like, does an additional year of education have the same purchase for wages for people of color as it does for white people? And so to think about, like, what is it that you're measuring, and assuming that it may, of course, there are some assumptions that are built into the modeling, but I do think, like, understanding, or I guess anticipating or appreciating that, like, not every variable is going to hit folks in the same way, also has to be kind of like underlying your thinking when you're thinking about the methodological approaches to this.
Yeah.
And I would also just add on to what Stephen was just saying as well about, there are a lot of underlying assumptions there as well, which is that for people, from what Stephen was just saying, I think that's an excellent point. We always need to be, cognizant of thinking about those points as we're developing studies, we're designing interventions. But at the end of the day, if diverse voices are not in the room, to be able to look at that and say, hey, actually, that's not the way I would have asked that question, or that is not relevant for these reasons, we will continue to perpetuate things to be exactly the way that they are. I think that, Scott Page has done a lot of work on the benefits of adding diversity into structures organizationally and how it improves, creativity, and it improves the way that we get to solutions more quickly and effectively. And I think that when you think about data, there's no difference there. Being able to bring in different voices and different perspectives will only strengthen the products that we're creating.
Yeah,
Don, the thing I'd add on this question, the thing I'd add real quick, it's a great question. I'm sure a lot of researchers in our community are thinking about it. It's worthy of a paper, a review article, maybe like a handbook chapter, or maybe a whole theme issue of how to handle methodologically, how to handle race and what the issues are around that, both in terms of the quantitative methods, but in terms of interpretation and study design. And if that is not out there, if it is out there, I would love someone to send me, hey, you got to look at these papers. If it's not out there, we ought to be commissioning that, as a community, like get that codified and disseminated.
Yeah. I'm just seeing there are several people asking some version of the question or making a statement about diversity, equity, inclusion, not really being enough, and that we need diverse teams, but that's just a starting point. And I'll just share, within Social Science Research Institute at Duke, we've started trying to talk about what it would mean to create a generative culture, because I think inclusion means what you have is correct, and you just need to try to bring folk up into it. But in our mind, at least, what generative means is trying to figure out what are we going to create together. I mean, it's not perfect. It's just another type of language. There's also a question here. A recent National Academy's report on mentoring says that from a mentoring perspective, the best way to get ahead is through the coattails of a white male mentor. And I think, this question is sort of saying, really, is that, how are we going to, how are we going to stop that process? Because that's sort of the essence of a structural process.
I can say a few words about that unless anybody else wants to jump in. I think, so first I want to say that report, that committee was chaired by my dear friend Angela Byers-Winston and Chris Fund and Rick McGee, and several other phenomenal scholars were on that study. And the work that they pulled together really did emphasize that, there are so many different things out there to try to work on these mentoring relationships and to try to increase the capacity of those relationships, in terms of thinking about, is this really all that there is? I mean, I think that, we as faculty, we as leaders, we have to take personal accountability to change that. So if right now the data is showing, despite what we'd like to believe, that that's the best way for people to still get ahead, that we need to think about what are training opportunities, what are departmental structures that we can think about as faculty want to work with trainees, what are ways that we can work to empower the students so that that is not the best or most effective way for students to get through a system that is racist. And so I think that making sure that all of the mentors that are involved are aware of that data and thinking about ways that they themselves can actively combat it is important. I also think that for the white male faculty, knowing that that is a position of privilege and power that you hold, my same question all the time, what will you do to perturb that system? And I think that goes back to what Austin said at the very beginning, which is there has to be an acknowledgement that to change a system where you're benefiting, it will be uncomfortable because you are now changing a privileged space into a space that is equitable for others. And Don, that goes to what you were just mentioning as well about this notion of inclusion. We should be striving for equity, where people can actually be successful and that everyone is on an equal playing field. It's not about saying, I'm bringing you into this system that is working for me. It's about how do we make systems that are equitable across the board. So I think that data is alarming, but it's par for the course for what's happening in academia right now.
And I imagine, Don, what would happen if every university said, all white faculty, you must attend and submit papers to your equivalent Black organizations, the National Medical Association, the Black Chemical Engineers Society, the Black Physicists. I mean, these organizations existed because Black people couldn't be a part of the other organization. Go to those scientific meetings, submit abstracts, present, build your network, because what happens, as Sherilyn was saying, is this is a network issue. And so if you're going to expand the network, if you're going to get to equity, then you've got to get out of your bubble, your comfort zone, and meet other people in your field.
Yeah, so we need to walk across the street and not ask other folks to come across the street to us. That's well said. Let's see, we have just a couple more minutes. I'm wondering what you all think of, we're talking about there's this race for a COVID-19 vaccine, and the question is both, will it be, tested in populations that represent our country, and then if we get a vaccine, will it be taken by some of the groups that are, at highest risk at least in terms of observed mortality. It seems to me like it's almost too late already for the testing of the vaccine now. I just wonder what anybody got any thoughts about that?
Don, they sent us a message saying that we must wrap up the session to stay on time.
Oh, sorry. See, I'm a terrible moderator guy technologically here. I'm sorry. God, the HSR folks are super angry with me, I'm sure. So let me just thank all of you. You guys I learned a lot, and you guys are so generous with your time and your answers. So thank you.